Hello all. I wanted to make a video on diversity and inclusion and how to work with those in groups. And I want to say up front that I feel very nervous to make this video. And the reason is because, I'm a white female. I'm not a member of a minority group. I haven't experienced a lot of oppression in my life. And I haven't been trained in how to work with diversity. I've just experienced in the norm of our culture as gender diversity and racial diversity and sexuality and all sorts of things have started to become more common topics. They've started cropping up in my groups, and I've had to learn how to manage them. Manage is a bad word. How to work with them in such a way where everyone feels valued. And I'm not. There's something about working with diversity and inclusion where oftentimes somebody gets left out of the conversation. It's like when I'm trying to welcome people that are quieter or people that have historically been oppressed, it's very easy to oppress the group that's been oppressing. To basically say, oh, women have been oppressed for years, so men need to step back and let women speak. And then men are like, well, what about us? Like, we're not intentionally taking up more space. That's just like, now can I speak? Like, is that okay? I've personally experienced a ton of confusion and guilt over my privilege, over my skin color, over lots of attributes of me that are lucky and give me privilege. And so I've really been working in my groups to find ways of having the conversation about diversity and inclusion in such a way where it actually includes everyone. And I wanted to share some of those ideas today with all of you. So let's see. The first one I want to say is there's almost always someone that's being left out in some way. So we think of it as like, okay, if I have a group, well, and there's like louder people speaking, then the quiet people are being left out. But the loud people have their own experience of exclusion in some way. Like maybe one of the louder people is older than everyone else and they feel their age is a reason why they're outside the group. Maybe someone's a different skin color, maybe a different gender orientation. Maybe somebody came into the room later and they feel like they're not part of the group because they arrived late. Everybody has an experience of feeling on the outside. And in the kind of modern social justice culture, it's easy to go towards, oh, I'm a victim and therefore I need to be helped and, given kind of extra space. And that's true on one level. It's really hard psychologically to speak up when we don't feel like part of a group. And it's really hard if we're not explicitly invited to make that space for ourselves. So I'm a big fan of facilitators intentionally making space for voices that might not otherwise be heard. However, I love doing that in a way that acknowledges that everyone is having a version of the same experience. So for instance, there's two games I want to share that I use for this, two exercises. One of them is called Spectrum. And in Spectrum, I set up two sides of a polarity. So I might say, on one side of the room, I'd love to have people that tend to be more extroverted in groups. Like it's easy for you to speak up. And on the other side, I'd love to have people that are a little bit quieter. And I let people arrange themselves. And then I say, okay, can we hear a little bit from both sides of the spectrum or from the middle? I might call on people. I might let them volunteer to share. And this allows for a normalization of, oh, both sides of the spectrum exist, rather than just, there's loud voices and therefore the quiet voices need to speak up more, which might be harder for people that are quieter if they don't feel identified with the other quiet people, for instance. What's another way of doing that? I've done that with spectrums of I like to receive feedback directly versus I like to receive it more indirectly, like through email or give me a little while to process. I could arrange people along a spectrum of age. So yeah, spectrums. Another way of doing that could be even asking a question of the room, like, how many people here are holding back because you don't feel like there's a place for you in this group, and give me a thumb poll, thumbs up, I feel fully expressed in this group, thumbs down, I'm having a really hard time speaking up because I don't feel represented or included. And then, rather than just it being a yes or a no, everybody is giving some sign Another way that I love doing this is called identity constellations, which is a game I invented when I was doing a training in Montreal, and we had, I think it was 23 women and one man in the training. And I was like, okay, well, we need to acknowledge this in some way, because it's obviously, I can see people in the room having a reaction and kind of looking askance and like, okay, how do I acknowledge that, like, there's a big difference here, and does the man feel left out? And everyone had a concern for each other, really. And so on the second day, I was like, okay, how do I find a way of raising the conversation that also acknowledges that we're in a leadership training, and that, people are having different experiences, might be having their own version of the experience around something else. And so I said, okay, one person's going to name a context of which they are aware that's affecting their experience. And a context being an attribute or a thought that's on your mind, or like kind of a frame, a social frame that's influencing you. And you're going to name it, and then people are going to move closer or further away from you to the extent that they are also aware of and being affected by their awareness of that frame. So, one frame was, I'm aware that there's many more women than men in this room. And almost everyone moved towards the center, towards that person that spoke up. And then we got to get shares of like, what is it like to be aware of that context? How is it for the man? How is it for the other people? But then we also had shares like, I'm aware that I'm the only Black person in the room, or I'm aware of my religious orientation. I'm aware of my age. And it was really beautiful to see how much people were just aware of and affected by their awareness of those contexts. And some people were actually in that spectrum, like they had a different gender identity, for instance, but they were further away from the person that had spoken because it just didn't affect their attention as much. And that's one thing, is like, sometimes we can almost over empower. We can go, oh, you must not be able to speak up for yourself because you're a member of this minority group. And it's like both our social and our individual identities feel important to me. And sometimes I want to, be encouraged forth because I'm a woman and I'm socially conditioned to like not speak up as much. That's true. Although I've kind of become a loudmouth over time. And sometimes I just want to like actually stay quieter and stay in the background. And like, there are aspects like of traditional womanhood that I really like. I love cooking for people. I love cleaning. I love giving massages. Like, I am a giver. And yes, the traditionally feminine trait, but I don't want to be encouraged to give it up out of empowerment all the time, because it's something that I genuinely enjoy. So that's one reason why I've been trying to find ways of like non-oppressive ways of allowing people to identify what they love and where those interact with their gender or different identities or not. One last beautiful way I've seen this done by a teacher of mine, Diane Mushel Hamilton, was she had people get into subgroups depending on some identity that they shared. So for instance, there was an age one where it was like, okay, in one group it's 20s to 30s, another group is 40s to 50s, 60s to 70s, and above. And each group got to have a discussion with each other about how gender affects their identity and how it was affecting how they were showing up in the group. And then she had the groups intermingle and talk with each other about their experience. And I love these formats because they allow us to talk about diversity and inclusion in a way where everyone gets to be represented, but nobody gets to be made wrong. And I think that's what I want facilitators to have an eye on, is like, even as I encourage you, like, if you're gonna bring about, like, even at the beginning of a group asking for gender pronouns, how do you introduce that in such a way where people understand that they're going to make mistakes with it, that that's okay, and that everyone's going to have a different experience? Like, do you say, throughout the weekend, we're going to require you to use gender pronouns for everybody? So we're going to have everybody go around and introduce your name and your gender pronoun. That works great. And in a group where people don't know anything about gender pronouns, that's going to be difficult. And so another way of introducing that might be to say, so in this group, we are going to use gender pronouns. And the reason that we do that is because we use identifiers for people when we speak about them. And there's very few things that are going to be brought up continuously when we refer to somebody more than their name and their gender pronoun. Like using she, her for me. You're going to refer to me as she, her in conversation. And so the reason that we identify gender pronouns is because it's personal and it's going to come up fairly frequently. And a gender pronoun is that, when we're born, we're assigned a gender, and that we've discovered that people actually, despite their biological gender, have different internal orientations to what their gender is. Like, as a personal example, I'm referred to as she, her, but I actually also feel a fairly strong identification with the term he, him. I don't identify with they, them, but I am not offended if people call me him. I think I'd actually enjoy it. Nobody's used that pronoun yet when I've introduced it, but I feel a really strong masculine side that I don't often get to express. Sorry for the background noise. So we're going to go around, and each person is going to say their name, and they're going to say the gender pronoun with which they identify. And throughout the weekend, just attempt to refer to the person by that pronoun. If you forget it, that's fine. That person might remind you of what their gender pronoun is. And, see how much you can remember and work with that during the weekend, and work with whatever your own reaction is to trying something new. In the same way where we can change names, we encourage you to play around a little bit with what is gender to you. So by giving that second frame, I'm telling people why something is important, why they should care about it, how it might relate to their own experience of gender, of name, whatever. Like, can I give some experience that they relate to? And I'm giving them ways out of how to work with it. So generally, like, in I guess the context to all of this is when we work with inclusion and diversity, it's really easy to have some group feel wrong for the way in which they're not being inclusive and diverse. And that to me defeats the point. So I've been trying to think as much as possible of how do I create inclusion and diversity by also being inclusive in myself in the wording that I use, in recognizing that it's difficult and that I'm going to get it wrong, and in using spectrums and scales rather than a black and white so that everyone feels represented. If you have ideas for how you do this in your groups, or what's worked for you to feel included, I would love to hear them.